So we begin this story on the road to Daisy. This journey, for me, began in the mid-1980s, after my grandmother, Gloria Kilgore, gave me a copy of the family photo album. I remember clearly Grandma sitting at my side, pointing out the different relatives and how they related to me. I remember asking her questions and even taking notes so I would never forget. These were my relatives, and they had passed away before I was ever born, and I felt a sadness for never knowing who they were. I learned at that moment how connected we really are. I searched and studied, trying to learn as much as I could about my ancestors. My grandmother opened the door of genealogy, and I walked through. This is when my journey began, to not only learn where I came from and how I came to be me, but also learning that there were many stories that still needed to be told and shared. Through the years, I have witnessed some of my loved ones pass on, and they too become the ancestors in our family album, each with their stories to tell and hold on to. The more I have delved into our family history, the stronger the pull of the universe becomes to connect me with others that are on the same journey. In this journey, there is no end destination. We are on this journey to keep the stories of our ancestors alive and pass on the tradition. This family has been keeping records, collecting stories, and passing them on to our next generation for a very long time. And the path is clear, that the goal of this journey is to carry that torch and then pass it on. So here we are, on the road to Daisy. Daisy is an unincorporated community claimed as a homestead in 1902 by Samuel L. and John H. McGee in Stevens County, located on the east shore of Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake at the mouth of the McGee Creek in northeast Washington State, bordering Canada. The county was created on January 20th in 1863. It is named after Isaac Stevens, the first governor of Washington Territory. Most of the Spokane Indian Reservation is located in this county, and from the 1850s through 1910, it was one of the state's top silver and copper producers. Lake Roosevelt, which provides water storage for flood control and hydropower generation at Grand Coulee and at dams downriver. When the lake was created, Daisy was safely above the elevation level of the shoreline. Folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote some of his most famous songs while working for the government on a project about Grand Coulee, the hydropower station in the area in the 1940s. Guthrie toured the Columbia River and the Pacific Northwest. Guthrie stated he, quote, "couldn't believe it, it's a paradise," end quote. Daisy was named by the McGee brothers for the nearby Daisy Mine. McGee Creek flows through the community. At the time, Daisy had a store, a hotel, a post office, and a church. Some of those still stand today. For instance, the Little White Church on the Flat. As the Floyd family has posted in the church, quote, "The Little White Church on the Flat was built by the neighborhood congregation of the Church of God, headquarters in Indiana. Mr. Charles S. Sumners, while in partnership with a Mr. Hopkins in a sawmill in Daisy, sawed the lumber and delivered it for the church at $10 a thousand. Construction started in 1902 and was completed in 1903. The land for the church and cemetery site was donated by Chat Gardner, who lived on an adjacent farm to the north. Some of the other pioneers who were active in the church during that period were the families of John Clemens, Uriah Eslick, Sam Fulgham, Beliah Eddings, Arthur Stringham, Wallace Cooper, Garrett Winnings, Josiah Potts, and William Maxwell. Two early pastors of this church were Houston Eddings and Dan Rice. The church was commonly known as Saints Church, and the area where the church was located became known as Saints Flat. Around 1912, a number of families involved in the church were part of a northward migration to Alberta, Canada. The congregation dwindled, and services in the church were eventually discontinued. The church remained vacant for a number of years, until Ralph and Myrtle Stewart began holding community Sunday school in 1940. During the next 11 years, 4 pastors under the auspices of the Pilgrim Holiness Church held services in the church. Reverend C.E. Dietz, Reverend Carl Bennett, John Kennedy, and Reverend Davidson. The date of the first burial in the cemetery is not known. The markers have been destroyed on a few known graves, and existing records do not show names or dates of the burials. Several graves were moved to the Fairview Cemetery from an earlier small neighborhood cemetery on the extreme south end of the flat. During the period when the church was vacant, the Fairview Cemetery Association was started. The first meeting minutes on record are from 1918. The association was incorporated May 28, 1924, for the purposes of maintaining the cemetery grounds. The first elected trustees of this newly formed association were Frank Bedeen, S.V. Ritchie, William Pierce, F.L. Green, and Ralph Stewart. Meetings of the Fairview Cemetery Association are held each year, even now, at the church on the Saturday preceding the Memorial Day holiday for the purpose of working on the grounds, electing officers, and taking care of any business matters. Any interested persons are invited to attend these meetings for work and fellowship. Membership in the association may be attained with the payment of $1 to the association secretary." End quote. On the road to Daisy, the history of this quaint diamond-in-the-rough community is revealed. For me, this journey was only beginning. The more I learned about this beautiful area, the curiosity was growing inside to discover how and why our family came to be here. In order to unravel the mystery, it became essential to discover the exact path that led our family here. Tending to the graves of my great-great-grandparents, Stephen Jacob Kilgore and Elma Clementine Martin Kilgore, left me filled with even more curiosity. Who were they? What were they like? How did they live? And why here? So we begin the journey with them and follow their road to Daisy. Stephen Jacobs was born to Charles Owen Kilgore, grandson to the Revolutionary War veteran Charles Kilgore of Kings Mountain, and Anna Mary Muma Kilgore in 1859 in Indiana. He had 3 siblings, one sister dying a couple months after birth, leaving only his brother Andrew, born in 1860, and sister Rosanna, born in 1864, in Iowa, where their father Charles Owen was farming. By 1870, he was working with the railroad, and Charles Owen had 2 siblings in Iowa, a sister, Irina, and a brother, Andrew Kilgore, a carpenter, who was also in the 40th Iowa Infantry Regiment, Company F, a regiment that served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Elma Clementine Martin Kilgore was the 9th born out of 10 to Samuel and Elizabeth Martin, also in Iowa, in 1858. Her siblings, Juliana, born in 1841, John in 1842, Sally in 1844, Louisa in 1846, Nancy in 1848, Joseph 1849, Thomas in 1851, Samuel in 1855, and then finally Mary Talitha in 1861. Charles Owen Kilgore's wife, which was Stephen Jacobs' mother, Anna Mary Muma, died in Iowa in 1881 at 43, and sadly, 2 years later, Charles Owen Kilgore's father, Stephen Simpson Kilgore, died in Kansas. Stephen Kilgore was born in Kentucky in 1803. He moved to Indiana while he was yet a boy, and he married Miss Rosanna Owens for his first wife. She died in Indiana. His living wife, when he lived here, was Catherine Fulkerson, when a maiden. From Indiana, Mr. Kilgore moved to Iowa, where he farmed 9 years and made nothing. Then he came and settled among us. In October 1872, he filed on the northeast of 27, which he afterwards sold to Jacob Zumwalt. He brought a team, 300 cash, and household goods with him to our midst. He was only a farmer. In Iowa, he was a justice of the peace and assessor, and was nearly always a school officer after he was old enough to vote. He was a hard-working man. In Indiana, he opened 2 farms in the heavy timber, clearing, fencing, building houses, and setting orchards. The children by his first wife were S. Jane, Mrs. Jesse Huron of Davis County, Indiana. Andrew lived in Iowa. Thomas married Cyrilda Edwards, and they lived in Indiana. Irene married William Adams, and Charles Owen married Anna Mary Muma. The latter 2 lived in Iowa. His second wife's children were Benjamin F., married in Indiana, Sally Edwards. Michael M. was one of our bachelor settlers. Jefferson married Mary Bruffy, and Millard F. was the baby of the family. The last 3 were owners of farms in our township. Politically, Mr. Kilgore was a Republican, as deep as ever was. He was once a Christian, but later believed the Universalist doctrine. He was elected township trustee November 6, 1877. "Talk about hard times," said Mr. Kilgore. "We know nothing about it here. Back in Indiana, when it was first settled, they had times that were so hard, no mills in the county where we lived. Dressed pork was only worth $1.50 per 100 pounds. No market for wheat where cash could be got for it. We could trade wheat at 30 or 40 cents, corn 8 or 10, and a cow and a half at $10 at the store for goods. Labor in harvest brought 50 cents or a bushel of wheat for a day's work. Coffee cost 50 cents per pound. There was no sugar to buy except maple, and we made our own and traded some at 6 cents per pound for groceries. We had no use for money. Everyone made their own clothes, spinning their own flax and wool, weaving the cloth, and doing their work for the family, often numbering from 8 to a dozen. Charles Owen Kilgore, his brother Andrew Kilgore, and then his sons Stephen Jacob and Andrew Jr., as well as daughter Rosanna, moved to Kansas in 1855. Stephen Jacob and Elma Martin married in Nebraska, January 1888. His sister stayed behind in Kansas with her husband George Bates and father Charles Owen Kilgore. In May of that same year, Charles Owen's uncle, Simpson Kilgore, sadly committed suicide in Iowa. The next year, 1889, brought Owen Thomas Kilgore to Stephen and Elma Kilgore. They had their second child, Lou Edna, a year later, but sadly, in 1892, Stephen and Elma lost their one-year-old baby, Ruth Christina. That same year, Charles Owen Kilgore lost his stepmother, Katie Fulkerson. After 3 years, in 1894, Clarence Martin was born, their fourth child. It was during this time that Stephen and Elma Kilgore relocated to Kansas, where Stephen's father, Charles Owen Kilgore, was living with Stephen's sister, Rosanna. Early in 1896, Elma's father, Samuel, died in Iowa, and 8 months later, Elma gave birth to Vern and Andrew. 3 years after that, in December 1899, Elma's mother, Elizabeth Irwin Henry Martin, sadly passed away in Iowa. 3 months later, Elma Martin gave birth to her sixth child, Glenn Darcy. It was in the early 1900s that Stephen Jacob and Elma Kilgore moved their family to Lane, Idaho, in Kootenai County, where he worked as a sawmill edgeman. They welcomed their seventh child, Floyd Irwin, in 1903, when Stephen was 44 and Elma was 45. Elma got word 2 years later that her older brother, only 3 years her senior, died in 1905. Her eldest sister, Juliana, followed in 1907, dying in Iowa as well. In 1908, Stephen Jacob and Elma Martin brought their family to a homestead in Daisy, Washington. It appears that Lou Edna stayed behind in Coeur d'Alene, graduating high school. And in May 21st, 1909, an article in the Spokane Chronicle reads, quote, Principal Davis then announced that each of the graduates was entitled to a certificate of admittance to the State University and also gave a scholarship from Whitman to Lou Edna Kilgore, end quote. And in just a short 4 months later, another article in the Colville Examiner reports that Miss Lou Kilgore will teach the school at Daisy beginning September 6th. So Lou was able to join the rest of the family in Daisy after graduating high school, unknown if she actually attended Whitman or a state university. And so this is how we got to Daisy. But as I've learned, and as time passes, the answers to all the questions may never be found. But to find any answer at all, over 100 years later, is a treasured gift. Sometimes, simply asking a question is the start of the journey. And as you travel that road, finding those answers, you will undoubtedly be left with more questions. Here we are, tracing the road to Daisy as my family took it 100 years ago. And still, I'm left with even more questions. What was it like there? And how did they live? What was their time like in Daisy, in such a small, unincorporated community, and for so long? And as time passes, the answers to all these questions may never be found. This journey is far from over and has only just begun as we continue on the road to Daisy.